Henry VIII is one of the most recognized rulers in English history. 6 wives, a break from the Roman Catholic Church, a legal and religious system rewritten around his need for a male heir. His reign is the subject of countless books, television series, and films, and his image is familiar even to people with no particular interest in the period. He had 2 sisters. Both were treated from early childhood as instruments for securing alliances through marriage. Both were sent to foreign courts to marry kings chosen for reasons of state rather than affection. Both watched their husbands die within a decade or less of their weddings. Both are largely missing from popular memory of the Tudor period, receiving a fraction of the attention given to their brother. This is an account of the elder of the 2 sisters, Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scots, regent twice over, married 3 times, and divorced once, at a time when divorce among European royalty was almost unheard of. Her younger sister Mary, briefly Queen of France and later Duchess of Suffolk, appears throughout this account as well. The 2 women were not close as adults, separated for most of their lives by hundreds of miles and 2 different royal courts, but this account covers both of them together. Both were affected by the same brother and by very similar political pressures. Margaret spent her adult life managing 2 governments that never fully trusted her. Mary spent hers escaping the marriage built for her at real legal risk and then withdrew from most of court life. Neither sister had control over her own life while she lived. Both, without knowing it, helped determine which family would eventually rule England and Scotland together. Margaret is born in late November 1489 at the Palace of Westminster. Sources place the exact date on either the 28th or the 29th. The second child and elder daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Her parents' own marriage had been arranged to end decades of civil war between the royal houses of Lancaster and York. Margaret is baptized at St. Margaret's, Westminster, and named after her paternal grandmother, Margaret Beaufort. Elizabeth of York gives birth to 7 children in total. 3 do not survive early childhood. A daughter, Elizabeth, who dies at age 3, a son, Edmund, who dies as an infant, and another daughter, Catherine, whose birth in 1503 is followed within days by the Queen's own death. Only 4 of the 7 children reach adulthood: Arthur, the eldest son and heir to the throne, Margaret, Henry, born in 1491, and Mary, born on the 18th of March, 1496, 7 years after Margaret. Daughters in a royal family of this period exist, in large part, to secure treaties. A marriage between royal houses is one of the few reliable ways 2 kingdoms can commit to peace, and Henry VII, whose own claim to the throne is relatively new and contested, depends heavily on this kind of alliance building. As a young girl, Margaret is already aware of her likely future. When she is told that she will one day be Queen of Scots and will therefore take precedence over her younger brother Henry at certain court ceremonies, Henry reportedly responds with open anger at the idea. It is an early example of a temperament the adult king becomes known for. In April 1502, Margaret's elder brother Arthur dies at Ludlow Castle at age 15, only months after his own marriage to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. Henry becomes heir to the throne in his place. Margaret's own marriage, already under discussion since her early childhood as part of a peace agreement between England and Scotland, proceeds regardless. The agreement, formalized as the Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1502, sets the terms for Margaret's marriage to James IV, who has ruled Scotland since 1488, when he was 15 years old. By the time of the marriage, James is 30, 16 years older than his bride. With a well-documented history of relationships with other women and children, he has already provided for outside marriage. Before the English match was arranged, James had seriously considered marrying a Scottish noblewoman, Margaret Drummond, but his council refused to accept the elevation of a subject's family that such a marriage would bring, and the political match with England goes ahead instead. Henry VII negotiates the marriage with characteristic caution, at one point pressing James for details of what he can afford to pay the ladies who will accompany Margaret north. A proxy wedding takes place in London in January 1503, with a Scottish nobleman standing in for James. Margaret then travels north with a large company of attendants and marries James IV in person on August 8, 1503, at Holyrood in Edinburgh. The Scottish poet William Dunbar marks the occasion with a poem celebrating the joining of the two royal houses. Some historical accounts suggest the dowry Henry VII provided was smaller than expected, and that this undermined from the beginning the long-term goodwill the marriage was meant to build between the two kingdoms. Neither Margaret nor her father can know in 1503 that this marriage will eventually decide who sits on the English throne almost exactly a century later. Margaret becomes queen of a country she barely knows, with a court culture and, in parts of the kingdom, a language distinct from the one she grew up with. Over the following decade, she becomes pregnant 6 times. Most of the children do not survive infancy. Her first son, also named James, dies before his 2nd birthday. Only 2 of the 6 children survive infancy at all. A son, also named James, born at Linlithgow Palace on April 10, 1512, and a second son, Alexander, given the title Duke of Ross, born in April 1514. In 1513, Margaret's husband and her brother end up on opposite sides of a war. Neither of them starts for personal reasons. That spring, Henry VIII invades France in alliance with Spain, pursuing a continental campaign backed by his council. France, bound to Scotland through the centuries-old Auld Alliance, calls on James IV for support. James sends Henry an ultimatum: withdraw from France, or Scotland will invade English territory. Henry refuses. In August 1513, James leads a large army, estimated at somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 men, depending on the source, across the border into Northumberland. On 9th September, near the village of Branxton, this force meets an English army commanded by Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, in what becomes known as the Battle of Flodden. It is the largest engagement ever fought between England and Scotland, and it ends in a decisive English victory. James IV is killed on the field, along with a large part of the Scottish nobility. In Scotland, it remains one of the most significant military defeats in the country's history. Margaret is 23 years old and a widow with a son not yet 18 months old. She acts quickly, moving the infant James to Stirling Castle, where he is crowned king on September 21, 1513, less than 2 weeks after his father's death. While Margaret manages a kingdom in crisis, her younger sister remains in England, 17 years old and unmarried, already known across European courts for her appearance. Contemporary observers, including a Venetian ambassador, consider her one of the most beautiful princesses in Europe. Mary had once been promised to Charles of Castile, later the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, but that engagement dissolved years earlier as European alliances shifted. In 1513, while Margaret buries a husband, Mary is still waiting to learn which king she will be sent to marry next. James IV's will names Margaret regent for their infant son, on the condition that she remain unmarried. The Scottish Council does not fully accept the arrangement. A regency led by the English-born widow of the previous king is for many of them an uncomfortable proposition, and some lords openly favor replacing her with John Stuart, Duke of Albany, a cousin of James IV, raised largely in France and next in line to the throne after young James V. By the middle of 1514, Margaret has gained control of most of the factions around her and helped negotiate a new peace agreement between Scotland, England, and France. Then, on August 6, 1514, she secretly marries Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, a nobleman close to her own age and recently widowed himself. Even members of Angus's own family are reported to have doubted his judgment. Under the terms of James IV's will, the marriage costs Margaret the regency outright. The following month, the Privy Council names Albany regent in her place. In the same weeks that Margaret loses her regency, her sister Mary's own marriage is being finalized in London. As part of a new peace agreement with France, Henry VIII arranges Mary's marriage to the French king, Louis XII, then 52 years old and in declining health. Before agreeing, 18-year-old Mary reportedly secures a promise from her brother. If she outlives Louis, she will be permitted to choose her own next husband. A proxy marriage takes place in London on the 13th of August, 1514, 1 week after Margaret's own wedding to Angus in Scotland, and Mary marries Louis in person at Abbeville on the 9th of October, 1514. The marriage lasts less than 3 months. Louis XII dies on January 1st, 1515. Under French court custom, Mary is kept in seclusion for several weeks at the Hôtel de Cluny in Paris, so that any pregnancy she might be carrying can be established before the new king's own position is fully confirmed. During this period, she becomes known by the traditional French title for a royal widow, the White Queen. Back in Scotland, Albany returns from France and is formally installed as regent in the summer of 1515. Margaret, holding out with her 2 young sons at Stirling Castle, surrenders them to his custody that August, after a lengthy standoff. By this point, she is pregnant again, by Angus, and in the early autumn of 1515, she crosses into England. She is received by Lord Dacre, the English warden of the marches, and taken to Harbottle Castle in Northumberland, where in October she gives birth to a daughter, also named Margaret. This child, Margaret Douglas, later becomes Countess of Lennox and the mother of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. While still in England, Margaret learns that her younger son, Alexander, Duke of Ross, has died in Scotland. Angus, hoping to turn her against the new regent, suggests to her that Albany is somehow responsible. Most historians consider natural illness, common enough in infancy at the time, the far more likely explanation. Angus himself does not stay by his wife's side. He returns to Scotland to make his own peace with Albany, leaving Margaret and their infant daughter in England. When Henry VIII learns that his brother-in-law will not be escorting Margaret south to London, he reportedly dismisses the news with a brief, unflattering remark about Angus's national character. Margaret remains in England for roughly a year, returning to Scotland in 1517, once a settlement has been arranged between Albany, Henry VIII, and Cardinal Wolsey. While Margaret is negotiating her return north, her sister Mary has already remarried, in very different circumstances. Henry VIII had sent his closest friend, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, to France in January 1515 to escort the widowed Mary home. Mary, unwilling to be married a second time for reasons of state, proposes marriage to Brandon herself. They marry in secret. In France, sometime in February or March 1515, sources disagree on the exact date. Marrying a royal princess without the king's consent could, in theory, be treated as treason, and the risk to Brandon in particular is considerable. Henry VIII is angry when he learns what has happened, but the couple is eventually reconciled with the king on the condition of a large financial settlement paid to the crown over several years. A public wedding follows at Greenwich Palace on May 13, 1515, with the king and queen in attendance. Afterward, Mary and Brandon largely withdraw from the center of court politics, settling at Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk. They have 4 children together. Only 2, Francis and Eleanor, survive to adulthood. One detail connects Mary's earlier household in France to events at her brother's court, 2 decades later. Among the small number of English attendants kept on when most of Mary's entourage was sent home in 1514 are 2 young sisters from a minor noble family, Anne and Mary Boleyn. Neither name means anything of significance yet. Back in Scotland, Margaret's marriage to Angus does not improve. Around 1519, the couple attempt a public reconciliation, riding together through Edinburgh to visit the young king. But Margaret remains unhappy about her finances and about the limited access she has to her own son. In letters to Henry VIII, she complains that promises made to her have gone unfulfilled. The Scottish lords, aware of her ongoing correspondence with the English court, do not fully trust her either. Contemporaries and later historians alike have noted that Margaret's shifting political loyalties during these years track her own financial interests almost as closely as they track her son's safety. In November 1521, Albany returns to Scotland, and he and Margaret set aside their earlier rivalry. Working together, with Albany acting as regent, they strip Angus of the offices his family had taken during Albany's years away. Unconfirmed rumors circulate at the time about a romantic relationship between Margaret and Albany. The alliance does not last. Angus's position recovers over the following years, and by the mid-1520s, he has gained physical custody of the young king, dominating the Regency Council and limiting Margaret's own influence over her son's upbringing. By 1527, Margaret is determined to end the marriage permanently and formally requests a divorce. Henry VIII, hearing of his sister's plan, responds with open disapproval, insisting that marriage is a sacred bond ordained by God and cannot simply be dissolved. It is a position his own actions will soon make difficult to sustain. Within a few years, he pursues an annulment of his own marriage to Catherine of Aragon, breaking with the authority of Rome entirely in the process. On March 11, 1527, Pope Clement VII grants Margaret's divorce from Angus. Henry protests the decision, but it stands. Margaret does not wait long to remarry. By the end of 1527, she has already turned her attention to Henry Stuart, a young courtier who had been keeping her official seals of state. They marry on March 3, 1528. Within weeks, the couple is besieged at Stirling Castle by a rival lord acting with the support of both Angus and, notably, Margaret's own son. Henry Stuart is briefly imprisoned. A few weeks later, James V escapes the custody of the Douglas family that has controlled him for years and takes refuge with his mother at Stirling. By June 1528, James, now old enough to govern in his own right, exiles Angus, confiscates his family's lands, and names his mother and new stepfather, now titled Lord Methven, as his senior advisors. Margaret and Methven have one further child together, a daughter, Dorothea, who does not survive infancy. By this point, Margaret's sister Mary has already withdrawn from most public life in England, dividing her time between her children and a series of long-term health problems that historians still debate. Suggested explanations range from cancer to heart disease to tuberculosis, though no contemporary record settles the question. Mary dislikes Anne Boleyn and remains a firm supporter of Catherine of Aragon through the early years of Henry's campaign to end that marriage. She does not attend her brother's wedding to Anne, nor the coronation that follows in early June 1533. Weeks later, on June 25, 1533, Mary dies at Westhorpe Hall at the age of 37. Her personal motto, adopted years earlier, translates roughly as an expression of acceptance of God's will. She is buried first at the Abbey in Bury St. Edmunds. When the abbey is later destroyed under the dissolution of the monasteries, her remains are moved to St. Mary's Church in the same town. Henry VIII, by most accounts his favorite sibling, later names his daughter, the future Mary I, and one of his most famous warships, the Mary Rose, after her. Margaret's third marriage follows much the same pattern as her second. Henry Stuart proves in time as unfaithful and as interested in his wife's money as Angus had been. At one point, he is discovered keeping a mistress in one of Margaret's own castles. Margaret asks her son for a second divorce. James V, for reasons that remain unclear, refuses to allow it. Margaret suspects, without firm proof, that her husband has found some way to influence her son directly. Later, historians describing James V's own temperament call him ambitious for wealth and suspicious of his nobility, though also by reputation more accessible to ordinary subjects than most kings of his era. Margaret continues writing to Henry VIII about her situation as well. He offers no real help. In 1537, Margaret attempts once more to leave for England, but is intercepted and brought back to Methven Castle, where she remains. The following year, she and Henry Stuart appear to reach some lasting accommodation, and Margaret grows close to her new daughter-in-law, Marie de Guise, James V's second wife. Historians studying Margaret's later life have noted similarities between her own experience of years spent among rival factions and difficult marriages and the later life of her granddaughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, although the two women never meet. On the 18th of October, 1541, Margaret dies at Methven Castle, following a severe stroke. Her illness is not initially considered life-threatening, and a message summoning her son arrives too late for him to reach her before her death. She leaves her belongings to her daughter, Margaret Douglas, though James V does not fully carry out this instruction. Despite their strained relationship in her final years, he arranges a formal funeral for his mother and has her buried in the royal vault of the Carthusian Priory at Perth. The priory itself does not survive. It is destroyed within 2 decades during the Scottish Reformation, and no marked grave for Margaret exists today. James V outlives his mother by little more than a year. In November 1542, his forces are defeated by an English army at the Battle of Solway Moss. He falls ill afterward and withdraws to Falkland Palace. On December 8, 1542, his wife gives birth to a daughter at Linlithgow Palace. 6 days later, on December 14th, James V dies. The infant, also named Mary, becomes Queen of Scots at 6 days old. Margaret Tudor, who had died more than a year earlier, never learns of this granddaughter's existence at all. Mary, Queen of Scots, later marries her English cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in 1565. Darnley is the son of Margaret Douglas, Margaret Tudor's daughter by the Earl of Angus. Through this marriage, Margaret Tudor becomes grandmother to both husband and wife. Their son, born in 1566, becomes James VI of Scotland. In 1603, following the death of the childless Elizabeth I, Margaret's niece and the last of Henry VIII's direct descendants, this same James VI becomes James I of England as well. Uniting the two crowns, his great-grandmother's marriage had first connected almost exactly a century earlier. The line of descent through Mary Tudor ends differently. Her daughter, Frances Brandon, has a daughter of her own, Lady Jane Grey, who is placed on the English throne in July 1553 in an attempt to bypass Henry VIII's surviving daughters in the line of succession. Jane holds the position for 9 days before being deposed. She is executed the following February at 16 or 17 years old on the orders of the new queen, Mary I, who had herself been named after her aunt, Mary Tudor. 2 sisters, married as teenagers to serve their brother's foreign policy, become, within a single generation of their deaths, the source of 2 competing claims to the English throne. One claim lasts 9 days and ends with an execution. The other, resulting from a marriage arranged in Edinburgh in 1503 and a second marriage forced by scandal 12 years later, becomes the royal house of a united England and Scotland. Their brother is remembered today mainly for the wives he married and set aside. What his sisters built, largely without his help and often against his stated wishes, outlasted him by generations.